Welcome to Transforming Relationships. I'm Dr. Eric Spiegel, and a variation on how I often introduce the show is with me is not just my co-host, Dr. David Alter, but also our guest for today. Hi, Dave.
Thank you. How do I look wearing two different hats? It's okay?
Both sides of your head look symmetrical, so that's good.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. It feels very honoring of the experience that I'm having here in Minnesota. I think it'd be relevant to our readers. And it feels really good to be in your hands because I trust you so implicitly. So thank you for that.
Well, we offer a hand to one another each time we do this show. And so today, yes, you're in my hands, but I'm also in your hands.
Okay.
So let's start on a really light note, right? So, you know, um, we're filming this on a Friday. I'm over here on the East Coast. We're getting ready for a really big snowstorm by our standards here. And we were chatting earlier, and I was telling you about running out to hardware store after hardware store to try to get salt, and it's sold out everywhere. And then, you just kind of matter of factly talked about, right, how you might be out there photographing your son flying a kite, and then, oh, oops, it's negative 20 degrees. Maybe you want to talk about that. What's that like for you to
Well,
have that
having, uh, in Minnesota, having been through many, many snowstorms, Minnesota is unbelievably capable of being able to remove tons and tons of snow very, very quickly. And I've had times when it'll snow a foot or more, and the next day the roads are clear. I mean, clear, as if you don't know that it snowed, clear. But that's very different than this biting cold. Is you walk outside, if you have exposed skin, you know it in seconds. So you said a lighter topic. Well, that's the antithesis of what I feel like when I walk out. I've got my heavy coat and my big boots and my special winter mittens and so forth. It's really, really cold here, cold and icy.
And on that note, cold, icy, biting, exposed. What a wonderful segue into our topic for today. So the title of our show is called Minnesota Nice ? The N in nice is lowercase and the ice is obviously uppercase, which is just a reference to the experience of Minnesotans and particularly residents of the Twin Cities. And we thought, what an incredible opportunity, right? The fact that you
As
are a
I said,
citizen, father, grandfather, a psychologist. I'm sure we could use other descriptors of Minneapolis and Minnesota. And so we just thought this would be a great opportunity to hear your perspective. So I want to just start off, David, and ask you, on an emotional level, what has it been like to be living in Minneapolis in a really unprecedented incursion of essentially like a paramilitary force? And to be clear, in using those descriptors, I'm not trying to alienate any of our right-leaning viewers. I'm certainly not trying to imply that immigration is not an important issue for our country to address and for there to be pathways for our government to be able to enforce whether people are here legally or illegally. But I think we're talking about something else. And that's really where I wanted to start, is to ask you about that something else, to speak to what is that? What is it like to live in Minneapolis in a time like this?
well, it is both disorienting, destabilizing, and frightening. Okay. Now, let me go down each of those paths a little bit. Okay. Um, Disorienting. Well, that suggests, well, what's the orientation? I actually think that in any country, having some control over the inflow and outflow of the people within the borders is essential to being a country, right? I think that we saw, as a consequence of the horrible years-long war in Syria, that well over 1 million people emigrated, many of them to Germany, into West Germany. Good-hearted intention to take in people devastated by war, but to have to absorb over 1 million people in a country many times smaller than the United States in a very short period of time had tremendous unintended consequences. You can't just move people, families, faiths, cultures around willy-nilly without that being disorienting, right? And I think in Minnesota, it has for many, many years had incredibly high levels of social services that has made it the home for the Hmong people of Laos. It has made it the home for Sudanese people. It has made it a home for Somalis. It's
Mhm.
made it a home for many, many different disadvantaged people from around the world. So again, getting people into this country where they can finally be free to explore their potential, pursue their potential, has been part of what has made this country great for over 200 years, right? So it's disorienting to see how what is an essential good has turned into something so ugly and awful. It's destabilizing because the way it's being done is not really about what the original mission was declared to be, which is to recognize that in addition to the people who needed a place to call home, a new place to call home so they could be who they are capable of being, that also meant that some people who had other intentions got in as well. There's a huge fraud case that we're still unfolding to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars of government fraud under the name of Feed the Starving Children that unfortunately went to people, most of whom were of Somali descent, and they stole money. They stole taxpayer money. So that's a criminal issue, but it's been turned into a reason that all Somali people, and frankly, all people with darker skin and all it's destabilizing. That's not what we're about here. And people are the stories I'm sure most of you have seen in the paper. They're terrible. So again, I'm not saying there isn't an underlying basis, but the way it's being carried out is horrific. So it's destabilizing. It's very destabilizing. Go ahead. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject for a second. You said the stories that you, meaning all of us, are reading in the paper, but you're right there on the ground. So I was wondering if you could bring some of those stories to life for
Okay.
our listeners and viewers. And I don't know this, that might be things that you've witnessed in your neighborhood. It might be things you've witnessed when you're at work or out and about. It might be stories that you've heard shared firsthand from clients or friends. Talk to us a little bit about that experience.
There are many, not 4 blocks from where my middle child and his fiance live. Renee Nicole Good was shot to death.
4 blocks.
4 blocks, areas where they go out to walk. You can't walk. So it hit very close to home there. It's a neighbor. It hit home because my 2 grandchildren uh, have, since they were before 1 year old, have been in a Spanish immersion school. They speak 1 year old not so much, although we don't use the word water because she says agua. We don't use the word milk because she says leche. So it's funny. You realize they're absorbing this language. They're going to be bilingual people, which we're very excited by. So it's a beautiful neighborhood school, very warm. We've had such good times there and they love it there. But the school has been closed on a number of days because not enough teachers feel safe to leave their homes and drive to school, which means selfishly, because my son and his wife have to work, my wife and I have to fill in to watch the kids because they're not at school. We are involved in driving teachers to the school, going early in the morning to pick them up at their home and escort them to the school and pick them up at the school and escort them back home because they don't feel safe to drive. We've had members of the school faculty who've been picked up or members of their family who've been picked up while they're just out shopping. People are disappearing
When you say picked up,
by ICE.
what happens? Talk more about like what you've heard about those.
Officers will surround a person, and we don't necessarily know the basis. We hear stories that they ask for ID, they give their idea, they say they are U.S. citizens. It doesn't matter. They're taken anyway. They're handcuffed and they're put into a van and driven away. We've had stories that I have received secondhand. I didn't witness it personally, where kids were at the daycare at school, which is on the grounds of the church. The parents were picked up during the day. The kids were left at school. So the neighborhood, other parents had to figure out, what are we going to do with these kids? The parents aren't coming to get them. The parents were gone. So there's a callousness, there's a brutality that I think flows upward to the administration, to people within the administration that I think have lost their heart. They're operating in some manner that is disconnected from what our podcast is about, which is healthy relatedness and how stabilizing, how orienting, how grounding, how connecting healthy relationships are. And this is exactly the opposite. So I feel that
Yeah,
my grandkids are asking questions that they shouldn't be asking,
that's right.
right? We're dropping food off for people who can't go get groceries. We've suddenly become chauffeurs because it's not safe to drive the streets. So it's horrible.
And you know, there's so many heartrending aspects to what you just said. I mean, obviously, trying to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of a child whose parents never arrived to pick them up from preschool or school, never have an answer why, you know, the community has to scramble to send someone. That person has to explain on a level that a little child could understand. That child has to go home, going home to not having any parents there. I mean, that hits on such a hard level, you know, and on a more sort of direct personal level of what you were saying, I was trying to imagine you're literally going to a teacher's house at your grandchild's school, and I don't know, and maybe you can speak to this, like, you park your car, are you looking around when you get out to see if there's anyone there? I mean, like, how is it
You're
affecting you?
texting to say we're coming, or when we're delivering food, we're here. And there are apps now that will send that message in both Spanish and English, or whatever the other languages besides English. So they're very brief, pretty impersonal connections. We don't sit and schmooze. We don't sit and chat. So there's a general sense of unsafety, right? There's a sense of mistrust. As someone who's a student of history, I've seen this plot, I've read this plot in many novels, where you'll see in an espionage film that people approach each other. There's some sort of signal given to let the other know, I'm the one that you're looking for. And they don't sit and talk. Something is exchanged. They go their separate ways. And it implies the larger context is not safe. You don't know who's watching. So we have to do this sort of surreptitiously. I had a personal experience when I was 17. I had an opportunity to go to Europe with a group of other kids behind the Iron Curtain. Back then, it was the USSR, the Soviet Union. Now, at the time, uh, there was an awakening within the Soviet Union in response to people who had been suppressed and rights suppressed and jobs taken away. They were fired from jobs because of their national or religious identity. And because of the Soviet logic, if you don't have a job in a communist system, the government can say, well, then you're a parasite on the people, right? You're not contributing your share because it's a commune like country. Everybody is responsible for everybody else, at least in theory. So the government would fire you and then blame you for being a drain on the country, on your neighbors, and therefore they could jail you. Okay. So the solution was you could be a citizen of another country, and then that country could be responsible for you. So while I'm getting ready for this summer trip behind the Iron Curtain, Poland, Soviet Russia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and so forth. I was approached by someone I vaguely knew who said, would you be willing to take some papers in with you? So I'm an idiotic, risk taking 17-year-old. And I said, sure, that sounds fun. And I said, well, what are these papers? They're forged citizenship papers. And there's someone at one of the destinations you're going to be going to that will meet you. You'll give them the papers, and that's it. And I realized, holy cow, I'm involved in something. They know that I'm going. They know where I'm going. Someone there has been alerted that I'm coming, and they're going to look for papers. So there's a whole drama that I could talk to you about. But I ended up finding a way to take the papers in with me, hidden among other papers that I had. I walked with my friends up to this building. Someone came up to me and said, do you have something for me? I said, yes. Could I have it now? I said, sure. I gave them the papers and they melted into the crowd.
How did they to look for you?
Clearly, there's a larger network here. This is part of what I'm saying is even here in Minneapolis, we're seeing all sorts of forms of resistance. The heavier the shoe, the heavier the foot that you feel is on your neck, the more creative the response to find a way to say, I don't want freedom, autonomy, liberty to die. And so we have these creative things that begin to emerge at great risk, right? So I learned many, many months later that whoever those papers were for applied for and was granted permission to leave the Soviet Union. They left the country and they started a life in some country where they had freedom. So that was my one contribution to history, but I don't really know how it happened. I was just a pawn in a larger process. But closer to home, the delivery of food, the chauffeuring, the watching the kids during the day until the schools reopen, starting GoFundMe pages and contributing so that people have some cash flow during these darker times. And again, I'm not saying that some accountability around the theme of legal or illegal immigration, some accountability around the theme of lawfulness or unlawfulness, those are legitimate concerns.
Right.
How you implement them is the issue.
And we psychologists love to talk about process. It's about the process, the
Yeah,
way you do it.
the way you do it.
And it's that way that was just really kind of sticking with me because, you were sharing two sets of stories from different periods of your life. One was sort of more almost inadvertent, accidental. You had some understanding of what you were doing, but maybe not the life experience to realize the depth of the ramifications. Now, obviously, you're older. You do have more of an understanding of that. But David, it reminds me actually of a comment that another prospective guest on our show made to us when we were talking with him. And he said, the way you know you're living in a fascist society is when you have to ask yourself those questions. Like, you know, is it safe to drop off some forged citizenship papers? That's probably a clearer cut example, but is it safe to go on my dual language app to a house to pick somebody up, to drive them to school, to teach my grandchildren, mind you, right? Is it safe to do that? That's something we didn't used to think about.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting is that many of our clients will talk about what's going on in their heads as if who they are is confined to what's inside the skull.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is we're also profoundly and deeply and inescapably social. And we're incredibly attuned to our social context. And I can tell you the social context of what has historically been called Minnesota nights ain't so nice. Look, when I drive anywhere, do I see collections of dark vans with tinted windows? It scares me. I think, oh my God, have I happened upon an ICE action? You look, you sort of don't want to see, but you can't not look. It's like a gawker's block if there's been an accident on the freeway. People don't want to see, but traffic is backed up for miles because everybody has to see. It sort of feels that way. And again, part of, I don't want to go down an overtly political rabbit hole beyond what I'm about to say.
Go for it.
Well, I can say to the extent that I know myself, I'm a really dyed in the wool centrist. What that means to me is both that I think I'm leery of the extremes, right? Because I think extremism, in the end, if you think of going all the way left and if you go all the way right and keep going, you end up finding that they meet somewhere. I don't value one or devalue one more than the other. I think they're just different versions of the same thing. So I'm inherently suspicious of extremism. I'm a centrist in that way. But I'm also a philosophical centrist in that I think when you look at the values of certain conservative positions, there are many I identify with, and they are enhanced and enriched by some of the values of the left. Values of the left are kept in check and enhanced and enriched by the values on the right. So I think in that sense, I also think we're all better when we have some of both. That's why I think I am so much of a believer in a two-party system. Not this way the two parties are operating, but the way a two-party system operates.
Where they could come together on a bipartisan basis with different perspectives and
Yes,
parties and
yes,
find something that kind of reflected both of those that advanced the interests of the country.
exactly. The country, the individual, right? We see that human nature today is the same as human nature was 5,000 years ago. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Human beings are both capable of incredible greatness and incredible brutality, and
And
I
self-destruction.
self destruction. And so I think when I look at some of the values expressed by people in this administration, I don't feel that they are centrist values. I don't feel they're just right of center or just left of center. I mean, these days it's mostly right of center. There are certain values that are being expressed that feel to me very extreme. So it's not a surprise to me that when values are translated into actions and actions into movements, that there are a lot of people that are at risk. And I'm saying that even with many of the people who voted in the current administration, I think we're seeing that some of the things that they absolutely needed and believed they would receive, they're not. They're not receiving it. So I am very nervous, destabilized, disoriented, both conceptually and pragmatically in my day to day life. I'm just seeing what's unfolding and I don't know where it's going to go. So that's David Alter, father, grandfather, friend, community member. But I'm also, as you said in the beginning, I'm also a David Alter psychologist and a student of brain science. And there are aspects of that that further disorient and destabilize me. I don't know if you want to go down there, but that's another topic we could talk
I
about.
do. Let's talk to David Alter, the psychologist, and somewhere close by we'll keep David Alter, father, grandfather, citizen. So talking to David Alter, the psychologist here,
Mhm.
how do you explain what you are living through on the ground in Minneapolis? And I'd,
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to respond in two ways.
Okay.
First is, how do you explain it on a social, biological, neurological level in terms of the breakdown of society, the worst kind of characterological qualities
Mhm.
that lead to this? And how do you describe it in the best of ways in terms of the kind of response that you're beginning to see from the community and your reflections on how we can take aspects of relationship and community in terms of healing?
Okay.
Just a small question.
Just a small question. Well, I think that I'll start this way. I think that we people human beings are very, very story or narrative oriented. We invest a lot of belief in certain narratives, right? And we have this delusional idea that those stories are really strong. So America has these foundations, these principles and practices, this democratic system that's been in place for 250 years. We're celebrating the anniversary this year, and it's rock hard. No, it isn't. It's incredibly fragile, and it can come apart very rapidly unless each of us in the course of our days are doing the things that help reinforce it. So I have felt from a psychological or neuroscientific perspective that I'm seeing how what looked so strong can come apart so quickly under the influence of someone who doesn't seem to believe in the
Those
things that make
values.
it strong.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I then go, and this will be more controversial, when I take a look at never done an in-person evaluation of the president or members of the administration. So I'm deriving this from what I read, what I hear them say in their own words. So it's not as if I'm just making it up. I'm basing it on data that is out there. And much of it, as I say, is in their own words. What I see are characteristics of a person whose sense of himself is incredibly, incredibly fragile. I have treated people like that for 40 years. The way it manifests is you and I might walk around with a sense of who we are. We know we can make mistakes. We can apologize. We can disappoint. We can make amends. But there's a core sense of self that endures. When I've worked with people who don't have that core sense of self, there is a hunger that is unleashed to constantly fill, right? To get some sense of self, to constantly look for the approval, the support, the worship, the whatever we need. I remember a fellow who was a quarterback for a Division I football team, handsome, the stereotype, handsome, rugged looking quarterback, married to this absolutely drop dead gorgeous, brilliant, successful woman. Well, he had to still be that kid who's chasing woman after woman after woman after woman to the destruction of his marriage, to the destruction of himself, because he couldn't hold on to a sense of self that everyone else saw. He was empty. And so when I put that in relation to what I observe, I'm worried that the reward system that we all have, that's dopamine and what's called endogenous opioid based, these feel good hormones, these feel good molecules, it gives us the drive to go after something. And then that feels so good, the reward, and then it is reset. And we do that over and over so that we can display motivated action. What I see is the emptiness drives this administration to do bigger and bolder and more dramatic and more extreme things because the neuroscientific, the neurobiological system says you're going to show an addictive pattern. No matter what you do, the next thing has to be bigger. It has to be bolder. It has to be more dysregulated. It has to be more boundless. And we're seeing that play out.
Can I push back a little bit on what you're saying? Y- And I don't think you mean this, but I think you're using the term this administration almost like monolithically.
Mhm.
And I would just argue that I think there's a couple of characters. I think there's the president who you've spoken about, and I think that's a really apt description. It's just this insatiable hunger and need for affirmation because of these deficits, right? That he didn't get in childhood, which have been documented, in terms of his relationship with his father, who was very sociopathic and abusive, his relationship with his mother. I mean, in Mary Trump's book, she talks about how his mother was in the hospital for much of his first 2 years of life, which is, a critical period of time in terms of attachment development. But I think the part that and I don't know if you meant it this way, but that I was taking a bit of issue with is you've got his personality dynamics. And then I think you've got a couple of different character types. You've got the people who they themselves grew up in that kind of environment. So they gravitate towards somebody like that. They want to please somebody like that. They want to curry favor with somebody like that. But you've got the people who think they can manage somebody like that, but they're mistaken. And I think there was more of that in the first administration. But I think the critical piece that I just wanted to kind of name is then you've got the people who see a character type like that and say to themselves, I can take advantage of someone like that. I know how to pull their levers to get what I want. And that's really where you start getting into sort of like the puppeteers and the people with disproportionate power who are lurking in the shadows.
I think what is the dark side of our podcast, Transforming Relationships, the upside is the need for connection and community to really not just bring out the best of individuals, but because it brings out the best in each individual, there's a collective benefit where the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. That's when we really are capable of achieving our highest highs. The same is true in the other direction, right? Whether it's Stalin or Hitler or Mussolini, or whether it's some of the Roman emperors, if we go back 2,500 years, 2,000 years, when you have a collection, a community of people who gravitate toward each other in the ways that we're talking about, each unleashing their darker natures, we're also capable of incredible destruction. And we can justify it in this distorted, delusional way. This to me is why I have studied for many, many years what are the system of morals and ethics in each society across time. And what I have found is that if you go back 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 1,500 years, across the globe, you'll see that there's a certain core set of values that are exhibited and built into that system in order for that system to thrive and generally do pretty well. When we act out of our better natures, or as Lincoln said, the angels of our better nature, or the better angels of our nature,
Right.
right? We're capable of incredible greatness. What we're seeing today, what's destabilizing here in the Twin Cities in this icy climate, and I mean that in two different ways, is we're seeing what happens when people who aren't evil to their core are in a community where the darker parts of their nature are reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and we start to see that spread, and people are damaged. In one case, killed. Children now without their mother. I mean, it's terrifying, but not surprising. This is what has always happened when we don't hew more closely to human and humane ethical moral values. And I'm very concerned that those are not adhering to those values.
So given that, I think, astute observation, how do we transform relationships in a positive way, bottom up? How does Minnesota nice percolate up? Can you speak to
Yeah.
that, your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, I think what I alluded to before are the examples. I see it in protest marches. I see it in parent groups communicating by phone and text and email, creating GoFundMe pages, taking people around, buying groceries, watching children. There's a way that the bottom up processes form linkages and connections, sort of outside obvious public view. It's a bottom up foundational regrowth that brings us to a better place. A metaphor that I've used is that if you have a forest fire tear through an old growth forest, that fire will burn away the roughly 100 to 150 large trees that occupy each acre of forest. Within several months of that burn, 150,000 saplings will begin to come up through the ground, right?
It's incredible.
So there's 100-to-1 difference between the number that stand in an old growth forest because there is survival of the fittest in competition, but the urge for life to regrow, to recreate is what nature's all about. 150,000 chances to get back to where we used to be. And I see that happening all across the Twin Cities. Thousands and thousands of individuals are popping up, making connections, doing something that they can't do alone, but together they can do more. And so there is a powerful, silent, and not so silent resistance movement from citizens, from businesses all across the Twin Cities today. Many businesses are closed. Many schools are closed. That's why today my wife is watching both of our grandkids. Why are the schools and businesses closed? Because it's a citywide protest saying that's not what Minnesota is. That's not what the Twin Cities is. So when
It's
people
incredible.
are not going to go to work, they're not going to be on the roads. If they're not going to be on the roads, they're less subject to be picked up to ICE. So it's a citywide protest that's gone from individuals to schools to businesses to clergy to, there's a resistance movement happening because it's just not something we're going to put up with. And we're going to keep not putting up with it until some sort of stand down happens. We saw it this week internationally. I need to have Greenland. I don't have to think about peace much anymore. I need this until Europe at the Davos conference and the World Economic Forum speeches stood out strongly and said, this isn't going to fly. And all of a sudden the administration said, okay, no tariffs. Okay, maybe we'll do something else with Greenland.
Well, I wish I was as optimistic in the way I saw the response. I felt like it wasn't quite
As optimistic as I'm saying.
but what I do agree with is that certainly there was a resolve behind behind private closed doors. And, you saw that in the about face of the administration's response. And I think very tellingly, if Europe had really capitulated, Trump would be talking about exactly what he got for, this deal of a century. But I digress. I want to come back to I think the bones of what you were just talking about there. If I understood you correctly, and I wonder if you could elaborate on this, David, you were saying that every person's individual discovery, right? When they discover I am capable of something I didn't know was possible in terms of developing a leadership skill that's part of the resistance, that happens in a communal context. And then that makes the individual and the community stronger. Did I have that right? And could you say
I
more
think
about
so.
that?
I think so. There's something about a personal agency. When you and I treat folks with depression or tremendous anxiety conditions, there's a loss of the sense that they matter and that their actions amount to anything. So there's a certain loss of a sense of agency. So the individual can say, well, this is the national government. This is the federal government. What am I supposed to do? I can't do anything. Well, yeah, you can. So when you take an action and your neighbor takes an action and it turns out that your actions combined are actually in the same direction, and then there's a third and a 12th and a fifth that are taking actions, some of which are different, some of which are the same, it generates momentum. It instills agency. It distills hope. It distills out the kind of things that form an active resistance movement that ultimately, and this is going to go farther than we have time for today, resistance is necessary for healthy functioning, right? A two-party system that opposes each other, that resistance is necessary. Each cell in our body has two different spindles, some that push the walls of the cell out, some that pull the walls of the cell in. Why? Because in order for a single cell, and you and I have 30 trillion cells that make up you and me, each has that characteristic of pushing against and pulling toward. That resistance is necessary. So what I'm seeing across the Twin Cities is the reemergence of active resistance that I think over time will tame the excesses that we feel are pushing us down, because we need to be in tension with others. That's what makes it healthy. That's an element of health.
Well, that's the note that we have to end for today, but how apt that you're talking about a healthy immunological response on a relational and communal level, because our next episode will be featuring public health expert Michael Osterholm, who will be speaking to, I think, to that very thing. So I really loved the metaphor and loved the fact that, it really takes all of our cells working together and pulling towards and pushing against and finding that balance for us to transform collectively. So thank you so much for, just really on a personal level, sharing your perspective on the show. It's great.
It is very therapeutic and very cathartic to have a chance to express to someone who understands this so well what's going on here. So thank you for that forum and that opportunity. I appreciate it.
Of course. So until next week, we will leave our listeners and our viewers with your reflections, David, and we'll talk to everyone again soon. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to catching up with you again in our next episode. A quick reminder, while we are both doctors of psychology, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, does not offer diagnoses, or engage you in actual treatment. The conversations, the opinions of our guests, and any information that we share here are meant for your general knowledge, your learning, your inspiration, and your motivation to put some of our ideas into practice in your day-to-day life. Remember that everybody's body and everybody's personal health journey is different, so what works for one person may not be right for the next or for you. If you have questions about your health, any psychological or medical condition, or any changes that you're thinking about making to your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise routine, your medications, or some other aspect of your life, it's always best to talk with a qualified healthcare professional who knows your personal history. Never ignore or delay professional advice because of something you heard here with us. We want you to enjoy the show and to walk away with useful insights, but ultimately, you are responsible for your own health decisions. Please use your best judgment, stay curious, and always listen to your body. Take care, be well,